The child goes to the teacher who will guide that child. What do you mean by external moral authority? You use that expression a lot. Materialism has to do with when you are Hi, it's wonderful to have all of you back again for the course in Values and Spirituality. This is the last episode of book number 1, and on a interesting note, we end on the subject of ethical dilemmas. For those of you who have been following the series, you would note that Sister Denise has mentioned this topic before in a particular context, but in this episode, this is going to form the entire subject of this episode, because as you will see, it is necessary to explain what ethical dilemmas we face on a daily basis, what we need to resolve them, and what virtues and powers we should accumulate or inculcate in order to put this into practice. To tell you more about the subject, I bid Sister Denise a very warm welcome to the studio. Welcome back. Thank you. So, Sister Denise, ethical dilemmas. I'm going to read the part that I think will be a good point of entry into the subject. Values influence our reasoning and clarify our choices. In order to make good moral choices, we must rely on our moral conscience. Wrongdoing occurs when the moral conscience has become dysfunctional and our inner moral indicator is missing or damaged. Now, that is quite a mouthful. Tell us what you mean, and once again, tell us what this means practically.
Well, there are 3 areas that are in conflict with each other. One is, which we talked about on an earlier episode, that there is one strand, which is the archaic social values, man-made. The other strand is the more modern values based on human rights, liberal principles, democratic values, also man-made. Then the third strand is the philosophy of karma. Now, your conscience corresponds best to the workings of the philosophy of karma. If you espouse one or the other of the man-made value systems, you will find yourself repeatedly having to go against your conscience. And every time you go against your conscience, you will perform a negative karma, which itself will weaken you. Plus, you will get to experience failure or lack of success in what you're doing, and you may be surprised that when you think you're doing the right thing, you get a wrong result. So all of this creates confusion. On top of that, the man-made moral systems that you espouse and that you have loyalty to, they will sometimes go against you, against your better interests, and this will also create confusion. So your faith in the inner voice becomes compromised and less, unless you make yourself really on the side of the conventions. So you get a big clash of the 2 main strands of the value systems, and a third clash with the philosophy of karma, and in a way a 4th clash that you are confused yourself. So it puts you into a very weak situation, and then when you have to resolve an ethical dilemma, you don't know how to evaluate the things because you're just not aware of these strands and how they are impacting you.
Yeah, that sounds like quite a uncomfortable position to be in. You go on to say, wrong actions also occur when an individual's values are not clearly established. Education in universal human and moral values helps an individual to define and inculcate their own values. It encourages young people to articulate their natural sense of justice and honesty, to clarify their ethical choices, and to understand the governing principles that rule their lives. I like the way you phrase that. Does every individual have what you call a natural sense of justice and honesty?
From my observation, majority of people at quite an early age exhibit this. Say around the age of 6 or 7, children are quite sensitive to right and wrong, to justice. And at the same time, this is where the moral strands are begin to get imposed on that child. So the child is sensitive to what is there in the philosophy of karma, sensitive to the voice of conscience, and then that natural sensitivity is sometimes brutalized in the process of imposing one or other of the strands of man-made morality, and then the child is forced to doubt their own inner voice in favor of the external moral authorities, which are the parents, the teachers, and the religious leaders. And then these, this expression, the governing principles that rule their lives, get a confusion with that, because the external moral authorities will tell them the governing principles that rule your lives are what we say, but the actual governing principles that rule their lives is the philosophy of karma. So they will be, unbeknownst to the moral authorities, they will be deceiving the child, and that creates a lot of confusion, and those moral authorities are also deceived in their own right. So it becomes very difficult to expect a young person to clarify their ethical choices, because it's mixed between one or other man-made strand of morality, which in some cases corresponds to the laws of karma and in other cases goes against it. And then to untangle this is actually beyond the range of most people, adults or children, educated or uneducated. So it really needs a very competent moral philosopher to do the untangling.
Yeah, I would say. I want to go through the examples that is contained in page 104. The first reads as follows: it is right to allow our children to remain in school in order to receive a full education. It is also right to allow our children to learn a trade at an early age so that they can contribute to the family earnings.
Now, this example is really very clearly showing the first "it is right" corresponds to the moral strand of human rights, democracy, liberal principles. That's absolutely part of that. Whereas the second sentence is absolutely part of the other strand. So when you're looking at this example, you're not looking at the philosophy of karma. You're pitting one man-made moral set of principles against another one. And what people tend to do, because the majority subscribes to archaic social values, they will say that the democratic, liberal, human rights-based system of values is, by that token, wrong, secondary, lower classification of morality, and they will continue to maintain this clash of two sets of man-made values. Now, there are other parts of the world where the archaic social values are in the minority, and the liberal, democratic, human rights-based sets of values are in the majority, and then those people will say archaic social values are wrong. So it really depends on the society that you're dealing with, what they decide is right out of these two strands. Now, a person looking at this example is being asked to choose one or other of these man-made systems. But what I would like to do is to say very clearly, the ethical dilemma here is between two man-made moral systems, and what you need to do is bring in the third way, which is the philosophy of karma, and that means that you cannot anymore operate on the basis of generalizations, because you'll see both of these sentences are also generalizations. And generalizations are favored by man-made moral systems, but in the philosophy of karma, each individual situation has to be treated on its own merits, because there are no two situations that are the same as each other.
May I ask if you're willing to give an answer on this, or are you saying that the questions are posed incorrectly?
I'm saying that if you look at this as an ethical dilemma, you need to look further, and I would say, what is the ethical dilemma that you are actually faced with? You can't use hypothetical examples, they don't apply. And so I would take a group of people and say, okay, who is facing an ethical dilemma? And sooner or later you'll find somebody who has something that corresponds more or less to some of these examples. Then you say, okay, let's unpack it. Let's analyze the exact situation, because it depends on the intelligence of the child, the quality of the school, the likelihood of the child to go for the full education, what kind of a trade the child would have to learn at an early age. Can they learn the trade and have their education at the same time? How wealthy or poor the family is. I mean, you can't just make a decision based on these generalizations, because they don't give you the half of what's really going on if it would be a real situation. And I think the problem in moral education is that the educators believe, those who subscribe to either of these moral systems, that you can resolve it by using hypothetical examples. And my position is, the one thing you cannot do is arrive at a realistic solution using something imaginary. It's not possible. So you have to go for an actual situation and then analyze it. Then you can really bring in the philosophy of karma. You can see where the strands of man-made moral principles impact the situation, and then you can decide within that situation how you're going to go. And then you will pay a price, and you will achieve an achievement. So your achievements do not go without a price.
Yeah, that you made clear in previous episodes. Okay, so the second example that is contained on page 104 reads as follows. It is right to spend all our savings on our daughter's marriage. It is also right to spend all our savings on our son's education. There is only enough for one, and dividing the resources in half is sufficient for neither.
It's a difficult situation.
Yeah.
Again, I would apply the same approach. To what extent is this particular situation influenced by archaic social values? How far do they operate? Where are your loyalties? To what extent are you somebody who favors the democratic, human rights-based, liberal system of morality? What are the details of the son and the daughter? Who is the daughter getting married to? You know, all of these things, you have to look at the individual situation. And once you unpack the actual situation, and you look at it in terms of the philosophy of karma, you are able to arrive at a judicious solution. But looking at it like this as a hypothetical example, there's no way you can come up with something other than prejudiced.
What you're saying is that you would need all the information before a decision can be arrived at.
And you cannot use this to teach morality to people. Hypothetical examples cannot work, never work, but everybody believes in them, or most people do. And so we have to destroy people's faith in hypothetical examples. And that's not so easy.
Okay, the next one is justice versus mercy. Let us go through the categories, and you'll tell me why you chose these 4 categories. Truth versus loyalty. Tell us more about that.
Again, you are looking at the different value systems. So there are the archaic social values give much higher importance to loyalty than what someone on the other side of the street would call honesty. And so even in terms of terminology, to someone who gives value to loyalty, loyalty is eliciting an emotion that you cannot break loyalty. And then on the other side, the person will not have that emotion about loyalty, but they will have that emotion about truth, because they viscerally go with truth, you see. So again, you find yourself in a situation of 2 man-made opposing systems of morality, both of which don't work. And unless we see that, we're not going to look for a third alternative. And what I find really interesting is that spirituality comes along and says, neither of those work because they're man-made. And anything man-made, when you compare it to something that's divine, is less valuable, less complete, less effective. But in the absence of access to the divine laws, where you have no choice but to choose one of those man-made systems. But once you begin to get access to detailed knowledge of the philosophy of karma from a divine source, it changes the situation, it changes the landscape, because you can then apply that in the analysis. And then you find, of course, I am not looking at ideas only, I'm looking at facts, I'm looking at realities. And then you will say, okay, given all the details of this situation, here's the element of truth, here's the element of loyalty, how are we going to create the balance? The second one, justice versus mercy, the same sort of thing is going to have to be applied, and you're going to really have to think it through, and again, always using real examples.
Okay. Individual versus community.
The archaic social values give preference to community, and the human rights-based system of values gives preference to the individual. And so in each of these situations, you're pitting the 2 man-made systems of morality in opposition to each other. And at the time of writing, we didn't realize that that's what we were doing, because that's what everybody thinks of as, morality. And we didn't get, and I think most people don't get, that both of those systems are man-made. One is older, one is more modern. And some people say, well, if it's older, it's better. And another one will say, no, old is obsolete, new is better. and it becomes a matter of opinion. He said, she said. But when you bring in something that is not man-made, and I equate the laws of karma to the laws of physics. They just are. Those laws just are, and you can't change them by legislation. It's not in the hands of people. But what you need to do is learn them and experiment with them, and then you start to get a little competent, and you have, as it were, a technology of ethics and morality that you couldn't have before because you were just dealing with differences of opinion.
I see. Okay, so the last aspect that we have under these 4 categories is short-term versus long-term. First question that comes to mind is short-term versus long-term what?
Short-term versus long-term. A lot of people, especially those who are espousing materialist values, they will go for short-term. Live now, pay later, or pay not at all. Whereas someone who's more concerned about the bigger picture and has a sense of the importance of not being short-sighted, they will give greater importance to the long term. But again, once you start to bring in the philosophy of karma, you see that you are dealing with short-term consequences, mid-term and long-term, and you have to consider all of them. It's not a matter of one against the other. But when you're just dealing with either or of the archaic social values or the modern social values, it becomes an either or situation.
You end off this paragraph by saying, when we analyze our real life dilemmas, and I'd like to emphasize that, real life dilemmas, in terms of these 4 categories, the core values and the tension between them become readily apparent. As this tension begins to fit recognizable patterns, we are troubled less, can resolve our dilemmas, and make choices more readily and with more maturity. That's something that sits deeply with many a viewer.
I think so, but in view of what I've been saying about these 3 strands, we're going to have to interpret this paragraph slightly differently from how I would have worked with it all those years ago when we first started working with this. And what we find is that the core values, there's some core values belonging to one man-made ethical system and different core values belonging to the other man-made ethical system. Whereas the core values belonging to the philosophy of karma are again different.
What are the core values belonging to the philosophy of karma?
I think we would have to say that the original qualities of the soul, purity, peace, power, love, bliss, would be the core values belonging to the philosophy of karma. These original qualities are timeless, and they're nothing to do with public opinion. When you start saying a core value is honesty, respect, stuff like this is very human characteristics. These characteristics that refer to the original qualities of the soul are so subtle and so abstract that they're really beyond the everyday human. But at the same time, I would still call them core values that don't change.
Sister Denise, as you know, this brings us to a bittersweet moment where we're at the end of book number 1. Thank you so much for joining us for book number 1, and I do sincerely hope that we will get to see all of you in book number 2. Take care and goodbye.